There's a phrase that has become almost a mantra on the American left in recent years. Every billionaire is a policy failure. The idea is simple and powerful. If someone piled up 10 zeros in their bank account, it's because the system broke down somewhere along the way, taxes too low, laws too loose, political favors too generous. It's a phrase that sticks. Campaign fundraising emails use the word billionaire today 3 times more often than they did just over a year ago, and almost always as an insult. But here's the problem. While the rhetoric against the super rich has never been sharper, something strange is happening behind the numbers. The composition of the world's billionaire wealth is changing, and changing fast. And the data suggests that a growing share of that fortune today doesn't come from schemes, monopolies, or blue blood inheritances. It comes from people who built something millions of others actually want to buy. In this video, we're going to unpack this quiet shift. We'll look at why it's happening, who the characters are on both sides of this story, the dirty billionaires and the deserving billionaires, and what it means for the debate over taxing the super rich. Billionaires have never exactly been popular, but today, the mood has shifted from suspicion to open contempt. And that's not without historical reason. Think about the first person in modern history to actually cross the billion-dollar mark, John D. Rockefeller. In the early 20th century, when hitting $1 billion was almost unheard of, Rockefeller had already built his fortune through Standard Oil. He was, without question, a business genius. But his company also took advantage of weak, almost non-existent competition laws, and there's strong evidence it handed out plenty of bribes to keep rivals out of the way. That's the archetype of the problematic billionaire, someone who got rich not just through brilliance, but by bending the rules of the game. And that archetype repeated itself throughout history. In the 1990s, when the Soviet Union collapsed, a group of men managed, amid the chaos and violence of a brutal economic transition, to seize entire state assets, mines, oil fields, industries, for a fraction of their real value. The Russian oligarchs were born out of exactly that power vacuum. It's no surprise pop culture loves to satirize this type of character. Remember Mr. Burns, the billionaire who owns the nuclear plant in The Simpsons? He cuts corners on safety to fatten his profits, without a shred of guilt. It's funny because it's recognizable. Add to that a recent economic backdrop, years of high inflation eating into household purchasing power, and it's human nature to look for someone to blame. The narrative that took hold was this: billionaires use their market power and political influence to inflate the price of everything, housing, food, basic services, and then pay ridiculously low taxes on the profits. The affordability crisis and the powerful billionaire became, in many people's minds, 2 sides of the same coin. And political strategists mainly, but not only, on the left, realized something valuable. The billionaire is the perfect enemy. A tax on massive fortunes hits a handful of people that almost no one in real life actually knows. It's an easy banner to raise, because the political cost is close to zero. Except, there's a problem with this narrative. It doesn't match the most recent data. While political discourse painted billionaires as one homogeneous block of villains, a growing number of them simply don't fit that picture. Take Oprah Winfrey. Worth something close to $3.4 billion today, she built that fortune because millions of people, year after year, chose to watch and listen to what she had to say. There's no monopoly there. There's earned audience. Or, take Cristiano Ronaldo. His 10-figure fortune comes from one specific skill, honed to exhaustion, scoring goals nobody else can score. It's hard to call that a policy failure, and there are less famous stories that are just as telling. Peggy Cheung, co-founder of the Panda Express restaurant chain, built a fortune of roughly $6.5 billion by creating a chain that serves cheap meals to millions of people every day. Or Tadashi Yanai, owner of Fast Retailing, the parent company of Uniqlo, worth tens of billions because, well, he makes genuinely great t-shirts at a price the whole world is happy to pay. These examples raise an uncomfortable question for anyone who wants to lump every billionaire into the same basket. Can you really morally equate an oligarch who seized a Russian state mine amid the chaos of the 1990s with a clothing designer who built a beloved global brand from nothing? Most people's gut instinct says no. And that instinct is exactly what a recent piece of research tried to turn into hard data. To go beyond gut instinct, researchers combined data from three sources: a business magazine specializing in wealth rankings, a research firm focused on emerging markets, and a Swedish foundation dedicated to long-term global statistics. The result was a list of roughly 7,000 billionaires, spanning a 25-year period. The central question was easy to phrase but hard to answer. How much of this wealth is competitive, meaning built in open markets, competing for customers against rivals? And how much is uncompetitive, coming from sectors that historically depend on closeness to political power? We're talking about gambling, construction, defense, and raw materials extraction. Sectors where it's nearly impossible to operate without someone influential opening doors, a mining license, a casino concession, an infrastructure contract. And there's an extra category inside the uncompetitive group: inheritance. That might seem odd at first, after all. An heir didn't bribe anyone, didn't break any law, didn't cheat a single customer. But the logic behind that classification is different. An heir didn't do anything to earn that fortune beyond being born into the right family or marrying well. By that standard, inherited wealth also represents, in its own way, a distortion, not because of the heir's behavior, but because of the lack of merit in its origin. With that yardstick in hand, researchers reconstructed year by year, since the early 2000s, what share of global billionaire wealth came from each category. And the result is surprising. Between 2001 and roughly 2014, the uncompetitive share of global billionaire wealth actually grew a bit. The world seemed to be heading in the direction critics feared most. But over the past decade, something flipped. The share of wealth coming from entrepreneurs who built businesses from scratch in open competitive sectors surged to an all-time high. For the first time since this kind of tracking began, half of all the world's billionaire wealth can reasonably be considered honestly earned. And it doesn't stop there. Since 2021, the total wealth coming from sectors classified as uncompetitive has actually been shrinking in absolute terms. Let's get to the concrete examples, because they tell the story better than any single statistic. The post-Soviet oligarchs, that group that emerged from the collapse of the Soviet Union in the 1990s, peaked around 2008 when the group's combined wealth reached something close to $500 billion. A figure that, for critics of the system, represented a policy failure of monumental proportions. Today that number has fallen to around $400 billion. War has devastated much of the industrial base that underpinned the fortune of Ukraine's richest man. And Western sanctions on people tied to Russia's power circle have eroded the fortune of figures like the former owner of Chelsea Football Club, now billions of dollars poorer than he was just a few years ago. Entire sectors dependent on closeness to the state have also suffered. The combined wealth of real estate tycoons has fallen by a third since 2018. Higher interest rates, China's property crash, and the collapse in demand for office space during the pandemic combined into a perfect storm. One of the biggest names in Chinese real estate, once worth $31 billion in 2017, is now worth a fraction of that, around $4.4 billion. Casino moguls in Macau have also taken losses amid a regulatory crackdown on gambling in the region, and inheritance, that classic pillar of undeserved wealth, has also lost relative ground. In the early 2000s, nearly half of all the world's billionaire wealth came from family inheritance. Today that share has fallen to around a quarter. Traditionally wealthy families, like the descendants of major retail chain founders or agribusiness giants, still show up at the top of the rankings, but their relative weight in total billionaire wealth keeps shrinking year after year. At this point, you might be thinking, come on, this is just the AI boom. And that's a fair thing to assume. Fortunes tied to semiconductors and AI infrastructure have exploded in recent years. Entrepreneurs in the sector have become symbols of instant, almost mythical wealth. But even if you strip technology out of the equation entirely, the growth trend in deserved wealth holds steady. That means this phenomenon is broader than just a passing sector boom. Look at a few examples outside the tech world. Over the past decade, the fortune of the French businessman who turned a luxury conglomerate into a global empire has grown by roughly $100 billion, built on handbags, perfume, and watches, not chips or algorithms. Or the founder of a Chinese electric vehicle battery giant, created just about 15 years ago, now worth $60 billion. Or the first self-made female billionaire in Russia with no inheritance and no advantageous marriage, founder of the country's largest online retailer, created back in 2004. Fortunes being born in luxury fashion, batteries, online retail, fast food, basic clothing. The common denominator isn't the sector, it's the model, people building something that serves a huge number of people and being rewarded proportionally for it. If the makeup of billionaire wealth really is shifting, it's worth asking why. Three forces seem to explain most of the phenomenon. The first is a bull market that has now lasted more than a decade. Global stocks have delivered an average return of over 13% a year during that period. Low interest rates, early on, pushed investors toward riskier assets. Later, tech optimism kept the party going even as rates climbed back up. Anyone whose wealth was concentrated in their own company's shares, as is typically the case for founders, reaped the benefits of that valuation surge at scale. The second force is, paradoxically, Chinese economic growth. At first glance, that doesn't add up. China's economy has grown more slowly over the past decade than it did in the 2000s, and yet the number of billionaires in the country jumped from around 200 to around 800. The explanation lies in a counterintuitive piece of math. Creating a billionaire isn't a linear process. In still poor countries, even rapid growth leaves most fortunes far below the billion-dollar line. But as a country gets richer, a much larger number of fortunes end up hovering right around that threshold. So, even slower growth can be enough to push hundreds of near-billionaire fortunes over to the other side of the line. The third force is mobile internet in everyone's pocket. The rise of smartphones in the mid-2000s lines up almost exactly with the start of the shift in the data, and that's no coincidence. Digital payments and instant messaging became ubiquitous, letting companies reach consumers dozens, even hundreds of times a day, straight from their pocket. That created room for entirely new types of businesses to grow at unprecedented speed. Short-form video apps, music streaming services, payment platforms, delivery, and ride-hailing apps. It has never been so fast or so possible to get extremely rich starting from nothing. Now we get to the question that really matters. Does this shift in the origin of billionaire wealth weaken the case for taxing large fortunes? The answer isn't a simple yes or no. For some arguments, the origin of the wealth is irrelevant. Democracy doesn't function well when a small handful of people can buy disproportionate political influence, and that's true no matter how that person got rich. An entrepreneur who built their fortune from absolute zero, without breaking a single law, can still use that money to try to sway elections, at home and abroad. He hasn't hidden that intention. And you could argue democracy would work better without that kind of concentrated influence, regardless of where the capital came from. But for other arguments, the origin of the wealth changes everything. It's much harder to defend the claim that this fortune was never really earned, when half of the world's billionaire wealth comes from people who built businesses in open markets. Taxing an oligarch who seized state assets during the Soviet collapse heavily seems reasonable to just about anyone. Taxing one of the greatest soccer players in history, the same way, using the same moral logic, that's a very different conversation. And there's another, more practical effect. The larger the share of billionaires generating, real jobs, real productivity, real innovation, the higher the economic cost of losing them. If excessive taxation pushes them to leave the country, or simply dulls their incentive to keep investing and creating, that cost falls on the economy as a whole, not just on their own pockets. The conclusion the data points to isn't that billionaires have suddenly become popular figures, far from it. But maybe the idea that every billionaire is a policy failure needs an important footnote, increasingly less so. At the end of the day, the world's billionaire wealth is going through a kind of quiet cleanup. Oligarchs losing ground, real estate tycoons shrinking, heirs losing relative weight. And on the other side, entrepreneurs who built something from nothing, a restaurant, a battery, a clothing brand, a platform, taking up more and more space at the top of the world's rankings. That doesn't make the inequality debate any less relevant. But it does make that debate more complicated and less comfortable for anyone who prefers simple answers. Because it's always easier to hate a cartoon villain than to admit that, more and more, the billionaire on the other side of the argument is just someone who made something that you and I and millions of other people chose voluntarily to buy. Does it still make sense to hate every billionaire equally?